Welcome to another episode of Cracklin' Rosie True Crime. Tonight we will cover the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. I will start with a short recap of the case for you in case it's new to you, and then together we will watch 2 interviews of Jeffrey Dahmer, and we will also check out some old news archives. This is a premiere video. I will be in chat with you, so let's chat it up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get started. Jeffrey Lyle Dahmer, born May 21st, 1960, died November 28th, 1994, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster. He was an American serial killer and sex offender who committed the murder and dismemberment of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Many of his later murders involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and the permanent preservation of body parts. Disgusting monster. Typically all or part of the skeleton. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and psychotic disorder, Dahmer was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 15 of the 16 murders he had committed in Wisconsin and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Dahmer was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for an additional homicide committed in Ohio in 1978. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. I thank you so much for being with me. Let's chat it up.
In the news this morning, on a serious note, police in Wisconsin this morning are investigating a grisly discovery in a Milwaukee apartment, the discovery of pieces of bodies. Police found parts of as many as 15 human bodies inside. Police were led there by a man who told them he'd been attacked with a butcher knife. Police are questioning the 31-year-old man who lives in the apartment. A Milwaukee newspaper is reporting the man has confessed to killing at least 11 people.
I desensitized myself to it. I don't know, I went to great lengths.
He is pure evil, but you'd never know it by looking at him. But when you hear him, that's another story. His killing field was Milwaukee, and he got away with murder for more than a decade. But how could any of this happen? For the first time ever, Nancy Glass is here inside the world of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Bill, when I sat down opposite Jeffrey Dahmer for this interview, I wondered what he would tell me, how hard it would be to get him to discuss his horrific crimes. What I found was that he was very forthcoming. He volunteered details that may be difficult to hear. I began by asking what he wanted from the men he picked up.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them?
Right, right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Jeffrey Dahmer is recalling his monstrous past. Almost 2 years ago in this little apartment in Milwaukee, police discovered the grisly remnants of one of the most horrible crime sprees in American history. Jeffrey Dahmer, an unassuming chocolate factory worker, would eventually confess that he had seduced, murdered, and dismembered 17 young men. He even ate some of his victims' body parts. He instantly became the center of worldwide media attention, a serial killer unmasked. There were protests and press conferences in Milwaukee as people tried to understand how this could have happened in their midst. How did Jeffrey Dahmer get away with murder after murder for 13 years? How did a boy born into a hard-working middle-class family turn into the worst kind of monster imaginable? In this exclusive interview, we put those questions to Jeffrey Dahmer himself. We met with him at the maximum security prison where he is serving his sentence of 999 years. For the first time, he talks about his crimes and gives us a chilling look inside the mind of a serial killer.
It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
The reason why Jeffrey Dahmer was able to get away with his crimes was because of just what you are seeing here. Jeffrey Dahmer is intelligent and articulate. That is what makes him so frightening. But if you listen carefully to his words throughout this interview, you realize it is a thin disguise.
You do sound, though, like the kind of person who could have said to himself, "This is wrong. I must stop."
I always knew that it was wrong, but after the first killing was not planned. I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete control and dominance over him.
The hitchhiker's name was Stephen Hicks. He was just 18. Jeffrey Dahmer took him to his parents' house. There he strangled him with a barbell. He dismembered the body and hid it in a drain pipe. It was Jeffrey Dahmer who gave those details to the police in his confession.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
During that time, Jeffrey Dahmer joined the Army and was sent to Germany. He was eventually discharged for a drinking problem and returned to Ohio. 9 years after Stephen Hicks' murder, the killing began again.
What happened to you in the 9 years in between that you were able to stop, that you were able to control yourself?
It just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then. And I started, when I moved to Milwaukee in '81, I started reading pornography, going to the bookstores. Eventually that led to frequenting the gay bars. And then one time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. Had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here, was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory
I
of
have
it?
no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
Dahmer says he snuck the corpse of his victim, Stephen Toomey, out of his hotel room in a suitcase. Then he took it to his grandmother's house, where he cut up the body and put it in plastic garbage bags.
When you killed these men, afterwards, were you repulsed? Were you upset?
No, at the time, it was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation.
But Jeffrey Dahmer was out of control. The urge to kill had overpowered him. As police later learned, he wasn't satisfied with his victim's death. He wanted more.
Why did you photograph them?
It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep something. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, at least I felt that I could keep their skeletons. And I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with the 10 different skulls and skeletons.
And what was the purpose of the altar going to be?
As a sort of memorial, a point where I could, I don't know, it's so bizarre and strange, it's hard to describe. A place where I could collect my thoughts and feed my obsession.
When the bodies were still in your apartment, there was no time when you would see them and say, this is grotesque, what have I done?
There were times, but the compulsive obsession with doing what I was doing overpowered any feelings of revulsion.
This man with a quiet, almost shy demeanor became a master manipulator who was able to lure strangers he met at gay bars to his apartment. He was even able to con the police into returning a 14-year-old boy to him after neighbors called 911 upset that the child was in the street naked and bleeding. Dahmer convinced the police that he and the boy were simply having a lover's quarrel.
It's an intoxicated boyfriend of another boyfriend.
Well, how old was this child?
It wasn't a child, it was an adult.
After the police left, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered that boy, Conorak synthesomphone. This man says he had a near-fatal encounter with Jeffrey Dahmer.
He wanted to take some picture of my back. He hit me with a rubber hammer on my neck.
He was lucky to escape because by then the killing had become almost routine.
Before you went out to pick up the man, was there any kind of ritual you went through?
I'd go to the nightclubs, drink, watch the striptease shows, and if I didn't meet anyone at the bars, I'd go to the bath clubs and meet someone there, offer them money, and we'd go back to the apartment, have a few drinks. I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. Person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
Watching the movie Exorcist 3 was also part of his ritual. It put him in the mood for murder.
I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape.
Did you like feeling evil?
No, I didn't. But I had tried to overcome the thoughts, and it worked for a while, but eventually I gave in.
While Jeffrey Dahmer may say things today that make it seem like he understands what went on in his mind, he does not. All he can do is tell you what happened, but he cannot stop whatever it is that drove him to kill in the first place.
Do you still feel those same urges? Do you still feel that compulsion, that obsession?
I wish I could say that it just left completely, but no, there are times when I still do have the old compulsions.
Jeffrey Dahmer says as time went on, his mind became more and more warped, and yet he was clever enough to continue to elude police and lure young men to his apartment. We should warn you, the details are very graphic.
I started having these obsessive thoughts when I was about 15 and 16, and they got worse and worse.
What were your fantasies about?
Any satisfaction.
He became so warped by his evil impulses that he even took a victim's head with him to work at the Ambrosia chocolate factory.
I kept the mummified head and skull of one of the victims in a carrying case in my locker at work.
Were you almost flaunting it?
Yes, but that's how strong the compulsion was. That's how bizarre the desire was. I wanted to keep something of the person with me.
Jeffrey Dahmer exhibited some disturbing behavior early on. He began drinking heavily as a teenager, dropped out of college, was arrested for indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, and fondling a 13-year-old boy. Tragically, one of his murder victims would be that boy's brother.
Do you know what started it? Was there any kind of incident that you can remember?
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.
His macabre 13-year crime spree finally ended when this man, Tracy Edwards, brought the police to the infamous apartment. Like the others, he had gone there with the promise of money.
He was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point. I hit him and I ran.
What was the turning point for you that made you suddenly realize that you had done something terribly wrong, something you should be sorry for?
It was the night of the arrest. I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim. They asked me where the key was to the handcuffs. My mind was in a haze. I sort of pointed to the bedroom, and that's where they found the pictures. And they yelled, "Cuff him." And I was handcuffed. And it was just the realization that there was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore. The best route was to help the police identify all the victims and just make a complete confession.
When it was revealed that most of the victims were black or homosexual, people in Milwaukee were incensed. Many felt that was why he went after them and why the police didn't seem to care when their families reported them missing.
10 of your 17 victims were black. Were they racially motivated
It was
crimes?
not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find.
While you just heard him say that his sexual preference had nothing to do with the killings, he has not come to terms with his homosexuality.
Never understood it. There was no use trying to fight it because I couldn't rid myself of it. It was too powerful and persistent.
Do you dislike it?
Yes, it's caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of conflicts and unanswered questions.
The conflicts remain with him, and so do his compulsions. But in prison, he finally cannot act on his savage desires.
If you were out on the street now, would you still be committing the crimes?
Probably. If this hadn't happened, there's no doubt I probably would be. I can't think of anything that would have stopped me.
On the night of July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee police finally discovered the horrendous secrets that Jeffrey Dahmer had been desperately hiding for many years. Acting on a tip from a young gay man who escaped from Dahmer's apartment, police searched number 213 and found a chamber of unimaginable horrors. Human heads and a heart wrapped and bagged in the freezer. Hands and feet at the bottom of his soup kettle. Skulls tucked away in a file cabinet, and this blue barrel stuffed with dismembered torsos soaking in acid. Dahmer would spend the next 24 hours confessing, telling in vivid detail of a murder spree that began in 1978 when he was 18 and ended with 17 young men dead.
I had this reoccurring fantasy of meeting a hitchhiker on the road and of taking him hostage and doing what I wanted with him. And I never in my wildest nightmares thought that it would become a reality.
Why would Dahmer have, as he put it, created his own Holocaust? How did he become so filled with evil? It would be comforting to point to an abusive childhood, an early life filled with hatred or horror, but his was filled with love.
Jeff was the most beautiful, darling, sweetest baby, the nicest young boy.
There just were no real signs when he was growing up.
Imagine your child grows up to be a murderer. Would you still love him? Would the guilt and sense of responsibility be overwhelming? Jeffrey Dahmer's parents have struggled mightily to understand what might have gone wrong with their child. His father's search for an explanation led him to look inward, even to write a book simply titled A Father's Story. But his search may be in vain, because even the experts and profilers who've studied serial killers are baffled by why they do it.
There doesn't seem to be any indication in any of the serial murderers that something external makes them want to kill. It's as if something is thrown, a switch is thrown, and they begin on the pattern of what their pattern will be.
Maybe all we can do is what Lionel Dahmer did, look back and try to see what went wrong. As a young child at the beach with his parents, Jeffrey Dahmer discovered a dead crab. He examined it with a child's curiosity, but later the curiosity grew into something unthinkable.
All I know is that I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like. There may have been some violence involved, some underlying subconscious feelings of violence. It was a compulsion, became a compulsion.
Jeffrey Dahmer got bigger, and so did his compulsion to look at the insides of living things. He began to kill them, satisfying powerful urges that he didn't understand.
In 9th grade, in biology class, we had the usual dissection of fetal pigs, and I took the remains of that home and kept the skeleton of it, and I just started branching out. Dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this.
More and more, Dahmer killed animals in the woods behind his house. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop. Then, at 14 or 15, it got worse.
I don't know, it became a compulsion, and it switched from animals to humans. I still don't understand it. I don't know why.
If your fantasy life as a teenager includes killing, who do you tell?
From about 15 years on up, a great deal of my thoughts were basically unshareable with anyone. So I just closed myself off and just put on a mask of normalcy.
As Jeffrey Dahmer entered adolescence, his secrets multiplied. He began to feel attracted to other young men. It was not an issue he could talk to his father about, but Jeffrey knew he was gay.
Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't.
And just as Jeffrey was becoming aware of his internal violent sexual urges, his external life began to unravel. His parents' marriage, which had been rocky throughout his childhood, finally ended. He found himself alone more and more. And then one night, while his mother was away on a trip and his father newly moved into a motel down the street, a fantasy Jeffrey had been having for years came true, and the killing began.
I was 18 years old, driving home. I saw this hitchhiker about a mile from my house, and he caught my eye. I drove past him, thought to myself, should I stop and pick him up, or should I just keep on going? I wish I just kept on going, but I didn't. I turned around, picked him up, and that's when the nightmare became a reality. It just seemed so bizarre to me that this obsession that I had been thinking about and wanting, just all the parts are there, and they make it possible to make it happen. Just at the time when it could happen, when there's nobody at the house for 2 weeks.
After the first time he murdered, Dahmer says that he tried to get control of himself and for 6 years he did not kill again. In 1984, he found himself living in Milwaukee, frequenting gay bars, when the violent sexual urges overcame him again.
I met this guy at one of the bars, downtown Milwaukee bars. We went back to the hotel, just planning on getting drunk. I had put some sleeping pills in his drink to render him unconscious. And was just going to spend the night with him. When I woke up in the morning, my forearms were bruised, and his chest was bruised, and blood was coming out of his mouth. He was hanging over the side of the bed.
This type of behavior and the urge that develops, it's triggered. It doesn't go in cycles. It may be a place that he's in that reminds him of something. It may be something that he hears. It may be a certain season. It may just be a color. It's intimately connected with memory and previous experiences and something that goes on at an unconscious level.
Whatever it was, it came over Dahmer almost like a dream.
I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have. And that's when it all started again. I had no intention of hurting him at all.
How could Dahmer not remember? It's hard for a normal person to imagine, but Dr. Helen Morrison believes that the brain functioning of serial murderers is unique.
Part of his mind is split off. Again, we have this piece of this puzzle that's somewhere that doesn't connect with the thinking part or the logical part. It's not far removed from those of us who drive every day and we drive the same route and we don't know how we got from point A to point B. We know we did it, but it doesn't enter our consciousness.
Unlike other serial killers who seem to actually derive satisfaction from the killing, Jeffrey Dahmer says he did not. His motivation, his objective was sexual. He wanted to create a sexual slave that he could totally control. And to that end, he performed the most horrific of experiments on his victims, literally drilling holes in their head.
I tried to create living zombies with muriatic acid in the drill, but it never worked. No, the killing wasn't the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control to do with as I wanted.
Dr. Helen Morrison, who profiles these men, says part of the reason is because serial killers like Dahmer literally feel things differently than a normal person.
To the serial murderer, it's very similar to the young child who may pull the legs off of a daddy long legs or a fly to see what happens. There is no humanity there. It's just, oh, this is a very interesting thing. They do things to individuals that they've never experienced themselves. They want to see pain, or they want to see fear, or they want to see agony.
And with Dahmer, that experimenting included what had to be the most shocking part of this case. He sometimes ate his victims, an idea abhorrent to anyone with even vaguely human sensibilities. And yet, here again, Dr. Morrison says that, in fact, Dahmer's behavior makes a peculiar kind of psychological sense.
Jeffrey Dahmer was not the only individual who was a cannibal or bit his victims or used teeth as a weapon. If you remember about infancy, if we go purely psychologically, the only way an infant interacts with his world around him is through touch, feel, and teeth. And this is a way that babies explore their world with their mouths. That's what they use. That's how they relate to the world. And what is evident in all of the serial murderers is this trait of very oral, or mouthing, or biting, or eating, ingesting, which is highly infantile, but it seems to be a way in which they can be with their victim.
It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me. Besides the just mere curiosity of what it would be like, it made them feel that they were a part of me, and it gave me a sexual satisfaction to do that.
By the late 80s, Dahmer had spiraled completely into a free fall of killing. A serial killer was on the loose in Milwaukee, but why wasn't anyone noticing? Serial killer profiler Robert Ressler says it was easy for Dahmer to hide.
He was fairly good looking and very shy. And I think I've often said that in any college group, you could put him right in the middle of a college group and probably you would look at him as a decent young man.
And that was Dahmer's most powerful weapon in luring his victims into his world. 17 in total. They had several traits in common. They were all men, all young, mostly minorities, and almost all were gay. Starting in 1984, one by one, these men disappeared. But nobody in Milwaukee had any idea that a serial killer was on the loose. Annie Schwartz is a crime reporter for the Waukesha Freeman newspaper in Milwaukee.
It was very much business as usual before Jeffrey Dahmer was caught. Because of the nature of the victims, the kinds of people that he chose, they were people that for the most part weren't missed by their families. They were often people who were tossed aside by their families because they were gay or they had had problems with the police. He chose his victims very carefully. He chose people that wouldn't be missed.
If families were not missing the victims, Jeffrey Dahmer's family was missing clues that something was terribly wrong. There were close calls, like this one with his father, Lionel.
I had a box in my bedroom closet, and it contained the mummified head and genitals of a young man I met in one of the bars down in Milwaukee. And it was a locked metal box. My dad one week came to visit and happened to see it, and he was wondering what was in it. He didn't know. Nobody knew. I told him it was pornography, some magazines. And he wasn't satisfied with that answer. We got into a bit of an argument because I wouldn't open it up. He took the locked box down to the basement and was about to smash it open. But I came back in the house, we reconciled.
The reconciliation with his father would mean the lies would go on and that Jeffrey Dahmer would continue to hunt down victims in the gay bars of Milwaukee and kill them. But in a city with a relatively low crime rate, why were the police not connecting the murders? Dahmer's seeming normality helped him hide his reign of terror.
People like Dahmer can get away with this easier because law enforcement does not recognize him for what he is. They're looking for somebody who's dragging their knuckles on the pavement and baying at the moon with hair in their face. They're not looking for Mr. Nice Guy, the quiet young man living in the neighborhood.
But there may have been something more to why the murders went unnoticed.
Okay, hi, I'm on 25th and State, and this is young man. He is butt naked. He has been beaten up. He is very bruised up. He can't stand. He's study fall out. He is butt naked. He has no clothes on. He was really hurt. And I ain't got no quarter on him. I just seen him, and he needs some help.
Where is he at?
On 25th and State, the corner of 25th and State.
He's just on the corner at the street?
Yeah, he in the middle of the street. He fell out. We trying to help him. Some people trying to help him.
Okay, and he's unconscious right now?
He getting him up. He is bruised up. Somebody must have jumped on him and stripped him or whatever.
The call is about this young man, Conorak Synthesin phone. The voice is that of a neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, who spotted the young man trying to escape Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer had already tried to perform his crude sex zombie experiment on the 14-year-old, drilling a hole in his head and pouring in acid. Drugged, bleeding, dazed, the young man had somehow managed to get away from Dahmer and yell for help. The police did come. Jeffrey Dahmer told the police that Synthesin phone was his 19-year-old lover with whom he'd been quarreling. The police went into Dahmer's apartment, saw nothing amiss, and returned the boy. The police then radioed back to the station, joking about what they had seen.
The intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend. My partner's going to get deloused at the station.
A month later, when Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, he admitted to killing Synthesin phone shortly after police left. The death would cost the two police officers their jobs and would force the entire city to look inward at attitudes and treatment of minorities and gays. There would be candlelight vigils and city-decreed days of healing. But Jeffrey Dahmer would leave a black mark on Milwaukee.
The place where Dahmer's apartment building stood was raised and put a playground in. Raised all kinds of money from the community, and no one in the community wanted to use this playground because they said it was the devil's playground. I think that the city of Milwaukee, at the end of the Jeffrey Dahmer case, was left with the unfortunate realization that it can happen here. It being whatever horrific thing that you see on the news that you think happens in other places and to other people. There was the sad realization for people that live in the city of Milwaukee that it could and did happen here.
But of course, the deepest scars would be reserved for the victims' families and the family of the murderer.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you! Jeffrey's out of control! Don't with me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you! Look at me! You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you. I hope you can deal with what you've done.
The families of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims had their day in court and an opportunity to address him. Jeffrey Dahmer sat motionless throughout. His father, Lionel, sat behind him. Jeffrey's crimes had been a terrible shock for him, so much so that for the first 24 hours after he learned of them, he didn't believe Jeffrey's confession.
How can you see your son who's been riding a tricycle and running around with his dog, Frisky, and playing tennis with me, taking a knife and cutting a person open, and then doing sexual things with it? It's pretty hard.
Those who profile serial killers can understand why Lionel would have such trouble reconciling his baby boy with the adult killer who would perpetrate such sickening crimes.
We do know that when puberty comes, the ages of 13, 14, 15, that the hormones seem to interact with the brain chemistry, and we have no idea what that's doing or where it's coming from.
I think probably there was a mixture of feelings of anger and hate and disappointment and also feeling extremely sorry for what he did. Felt very sorry for victims and their families, and also for Jeff, the terrible waste.
Both Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Flint, Jeffrey's mother, struggled to find a way to support their son in the face of his crimes, a brutal task for any parent to endure.
There's something or things so deeply locked up in his mind that even he doesn't know what's going on. And therefore, I have to hug him.
It's almost like I don't have a right to mourn or grieve because there are all these families who will never, ever speak to their children again.
By all accounts, Jeffrey Dahmer seemed to be relieved that he had been caught. He cooperated thoroughly with authorities and a battery of doctors and profilers who wanted to learn more about his behavior.
What was uncontrollable about Jeffrey Dahmer was the urge. It was the urge he couldn't control. It was the craving he had to satisfy. And that's why when he killed because he couldn't satisfy the urge any other way and had to do it immediately.
And this is something Dahmer seemed to know better than anyone. At his sentencing, he read a statement of apology for his crimes.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life.
The rest of Jeffrey Dahmer's life would last less than 2 years. In November of 1994, a fellow inmate of Dahmer's beat him to death. The killing occurred in a 20-minute period when the men were unguarded. Although Dahmer expressed repeated remorse for his actions, in the last interview he granted before his death, he made a stunning admission that he still had fantasies of killing.
It never completely goes away. I'll probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I wish it would go away. I wish there was some way to completely get rid of the compulsive thoughts, the feelings. It's not nearly so bad now that there's no avenues to actually act on it. But no, it never seems to go completely away.
Some neighbors here had complained of a stench for almost a year, but they never imagined what might be causing it. Milwaukee police were led to an apartment in this building after they were flagged down by a handcuffed man who claimed he had been attacked. What they discovered upon their arrival was almost unspeakable. Numerous pieces from as many as 15 human bodies, including 3 heads preserved in a refrigerator.
It's obvious that there has been a number of human specimens found within the apartment, and to a certain extent they have been there sometime.
A hazardous materials team, breathing from air tanks, confiscated a number of items from the suspect's apartment. Among them, police say, photographs and drawings of dead, mutilated bodies and a vat of acid. Police believe the suspect may have used the acid to dissolve body parts. Neighbors also say they heard sawing in the apartment at all hours of the day and night.
And now we found out he's got dead bodies in it.
What's your reaction on this?
It's shocking. It's terrible. You know, and here I stay right across the hall from this guy.
Police aren't certain if all of the murders occurred here in Milwaukee. They are reviewing missing persons files and closely communicating with other law enforcement agencies in hopes that evidence collected at the scene might help identify the victims. Brad Woodard for NBC News, Milwaukee.
On to the news desk. Ann?
Thanks, Brian. In the news this morning, a 31-year-old man in Milwaukee has reportedly confessed to killing at least 11 men and to practicing cannibalism. Police on Tuesday found numerous body parts in the man's apartment, as well as a dresser full of photographs and drawings of mutilated bodies. Investigators believe that as many as 15 men may have been killed. Thank you very much. Henry Champ reporting from Washington. In Milwaukee, police are still trying to identify the numerous murder victims found in a local apartment. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 31-year-old tenant, is in custody and has confessed to killing the 11 people found in his apartment and maybe more. Paul Hogan reports that the mother of one victim has been given the terrible news.
I had to feel.
Milwaukee police told Catherine Lacey last night her 23-year-old son Oliver, who vanished 2 weeks ago, is dead.
It's really puzzling to me.
Her son's remains were the first to be identified from the severed skulls and limbs taken from this apartment building Monday night. Later today, 31-year-old chocolate factory worker Jeffrey Dahmer will be charged with Lacey's murder, and more charges are sure to follow.
There are 11 individuals or parts thereof that were recovered, and those would include 11 intact skulls.
He just said that I'm the one responsible for what I have done.
Dahmer's attorney says his client is confessing to up to 18 murders over the past several years because it's time to tell the truth.
This is a very sick young man who has many kind of mental problems.
Jeffrey Dahmer remains jailed on $1 million bond while his attorney prepares an expected insanity defense. From Milwaukee, Paul Hogan for NBC News.
It's a frightening thought indeed. Dr. John Hunter is with us now from affiliate WAVY in Norfolk, Virginia for some answers. He is the Director of Behavioral Studies at the Pines Treatment Center there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Was there any way, sir, to detect that Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal behavior was going to progress the way it did?
Well, I think that it's important to note that most people who are sexual offenders do not progress to the point that they actually commit homicide. I think it's relatively rare. But the thing that I heard that was very important is that there were signs that the problem was there from an early age. It's very rare for an adult to begin to sexually act out as an adult. It usually begins as a juvenile.
When he was released from prison after he served time for child molestation, his father pleaded for treatment, and there's no evidence that he actually got any. Is that unusual for a convicted child molester not to receive treatment?
It's not at all unusual. In fact, most child molesters go undetected, and then they are either never referred to treatment, or the kind of treatment that they're referred to is not specialized enough to be effective. Most people who go to prison simply do not receive the kind of treatment in prison that they need, or they receive no treatment at all. And then once they're out of prison, it's simply they're a free person, and they don't have any therapy at that point either.
Is that the fault of the legal system?
Well, the legal system, I think, has to be interfaced with the people providing the treatment services, and that's imperative. You cannot treat sexual offenders, in my opinion, either juveniles or adults, without the aid of the legal system. They have to be there as a backup.
Is there appropriate treatment available?
Treatment does work, and I think that's important for people to remember. It's the kind of treatment, and there are some people who are not treatable. But certainly if you get most of these people into the right kind of treatment, it will be successful.
With people not getting the kind of treatment needed, though, what's the best way to protect our kids? Is there a way?
Well, I think that you have to believe children, and that's something that I've talked about from time to time. If a child tells you that they feel uncomfortable around an adult, you need to listen to them as to why. If they tell you that they have been victimized, you need to believe them. Too many children are left unprotected, left to the care of people who exploit them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hunter.
In the news this morning, the work of identifying human remains continues in Milwaukee as police press on their investigation of a ghastly multiple murder. Meanwhile, prime suspect Jeffrey Dahmer is being linked to mysterious deaths in other states and perhaps overseas. More from Paul Hogan.
Second, is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Jeffrey Dahmer told the judge he understood the murder charges lodged against him, and though he appeared calm and unemotional, his attorney says he's actually distraught.
He's a very desperate young man. He is very troubled, and he is in a high anxious mood because of what has happened.
The suspect may well have been involved in at least 17 homicides.
Police say they've widened their murder probe to include every place Dahmer ever lived or visited. Illinois, Ohio, Florida, even Germany, where 5 unsolved dismemberment slayings occurred in the early 80s when Dahmer was an Army private stationed there. They are convinced Dahmer has been on a murder spree for over a decade.
The information we received has ranged over a period of that time.
What time? 10 years?
At least.
6 of Dahmer's victims have already been identified, and the coroner here believes 4 more should be identified by later today. From Milwaukee, Paul Hogan for NBC News.
Investigators in Ohio have gone to work on reports that the bloody legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer may have begun there more than a dozen years ago. Dahmer has already admitted to killing 11 people whose remains were found in his Milwaukee apartment last week. More from John Hoylman in Milwaukee.
Pastor Dean Nelson spent his Sunday trying to heal the wounds of the past week. Nelson's church is just 7 blocks from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment.
What makes this particular incident such a tragedy is that it seems that all along Mr. Dahmer's life there could have been ways of intercepting and changing what has grown to be such a great tragedy.
While he prayed for the victims and their families, Pastor Nelson said the pain extends much further, encompassing the entire Milwaukee area and more. But while they preach, the story continues to take on new and tragic dimensions. Police in Ohio say Dahmer confessed to killing a 19-year-old hitchhiker in their state back in 1978. They say Dahmer identified Stephen Hicks as the man he killed at his parents' house near Akron.
We feel that Stephen Hicks was probably the victim of Jeffrey Dahmer.
A human bone was found on the property where Dahmer lived with his parents 13 years ago. Ohio investigators plan to dig up the yard tomorrow to search for more remains. Hicks is believed to be the first victim in what became a string of murders and mutilations. John Hoylman for NBC News, Milwaukee.
Investigators today turned up more than 24 human bone parts in the yard of Jeffrey Dahmer's boyhood home in Ohio. But Dahmer is accused of doing most of his killing in Milwaukee, and people there are starting to ask the police some hard questions. NBC's Jim Cummins.
As authorities in Ohio continued their search for the first of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, the people in Milwaukee continue to search for an answer to this question. Why wasn't Dahmer arrested sooner, before he had a chance to murder as many as 17 people, most of them gay African Americans? There's a lot of anger and suspicion among both groups.
We want somebody that's going to investigate the police department. You didn't say nothing about this white boy over here killing us over here.
Not only were these men the victims of a mass murder, but also of a police department that did not even notice.
By the time police found the remains of 11 victims in his apartment, the authorities had encountered Jeffrey Dahmer several times. He was convicted in 1989 of sexually molesting a boy. After Dahmer was paroled, his father wrote a letter to the judge urging him to get help for his son. Then, little more than 2 months ago, the neighbors called police when this 14-year-old, a brother of the boy Dahmer molested, was seen running naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment. The police returned the boy to Dahmer after he said they were lovers. The boy's body was among those found in the apartment. Minority leaders are outraged.
The police turned over that bleeding boy and then to the killer, to butcher. And if that would be another person, or if that boy be white, could it be different?
A growing number of minority groups in other cities are tired of waiting for the police to act. They are taking the law into their own hands. Police officials admit officers are usually more responsive to complaints from white, more affluent neighborhoods.
The wealthy person is more likely to be an articulate person. They're more likely to be one that the officer thinks is going to follow through. The officer may also think that they're going to be more likely to complain if it isn't handled by the book.
Today there was a memorial service for 31-year-old Anthony Hughes, one of the victims found in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Jim Cummins, NBC News.
In Milwaukee today, police detectives who took Jeffrey Dahmer's confession will continue their testimony at his sanity trial. As testimony began on Thursday, a prosecutor said Dahmer carefully chose his victims for his fantasies of sex and death. Dahmer has admitted killing and dismembering 15 young men, but his lawyers insist he was mentally ill and tried to control his compulsions.
The case against Jeffrey Dahmer comes to a close today when he is sentenced later this morning in a Milwaukee courtroom.
Did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? Answer, no.
After 2 weeks of disturbing testimony, the jury found Dahmer legally sane when he murdered and dismembered his 15 victims over a 13-year period. The prosecutor of the case is Milwaukee County District Attorney Michael McCann, and he's in our Milwaukee affiliate, WTMJ, this morning. Mr. McCann, good morning.
Good morning, Katie.
What do you expect will happen this morning in terms of Dahmer's sentencing?
Well, we first have the family speak. Under our state law, each family has an opportunity to express to the court the impact of this offense on their family. As a result, I think we'll see a highly charged emotional statements by the family, and then a statement perhaps by the defense. That's an option for the defendant. Then our office will speak, and I suspect there's going to be some very heavy, substantial sentences handed down.
Why do you think the families are why should the families be getting an opportunity to speak this morning in the courtroom? Why is that important in your view?
It's a reflection of the victim movement of the last 10 or 15 years. I was with the ABA Victims Committee, and we fought for that across the country to see that victims would be able to tell the court before sentencing. Always, of course, the defendant has had what we call the right of allocution to speak before sentencing. The defendants have had that since time immemorial. And in the last 10 years, now you see families of victims, and victims where there's not a homicide, speaking to the court, telling the court directly what the impact has been on them. I think that's very important for a court to hand down a proper judgment. The court should fully appreciate the loss that these families have had.
You say we should expect a pretty stiff sentence. I mean, he's eligible for what, life sentences, 15 life sentences.
Yes, I think he should never again be on the streets of any city in the United States. I suspect the sentence will be such that he will never again be a danger to anyone in the United States.
Does that mean he'll never be eligible for parole?
I would certainly hope so. Under our state statutes, it's up to the judge. At least on the last 13 of the 15 counts, the judge can set a parole date beyond any possibility of release.
What about when he enters the prison sentence system, rather? Will he be in solitary confinement, do you believe?
Well, I would think so. There's some concern about suicide, obviously. That concern has prevailed since the time of his arrest. I think there will also be concern how he might be received by the prisoner population. It's difficult to assess that. So there's concern that something not happen to him. I think if the opportunity is pursued by him and he really wishes some psychiatric help, I think he can get it. He suffers from what's called a paraphilia of intense sexual urges, fantasies. It's something he never dealt with. We offered him that opportunity when he was first convicted of a indecent exposure in our community. He rejected that psychological help. Now it's going to be up to him whether he pursues that or continues to pursue his fantasies.
What do you think was the most influential testimony that led the jury to decide he wasn't legally insane?
I think it was probably the testimony of psychiatrist Park Elliott Dietz. He had headed the government effort in the Hinckley case. He worked with the FBI in serial killings. He's an extremely capable man. It was a pleasure to work with him. He's situated out in California, and I think we were fortunate to have his services.
Do you think that, I know that his attorney, Dahmer's attorney, decided not to have Dahmer take the stand, instead to allow his police confession to speak for him. Do you think that hurt the defense's case?
No, I don't think it was. We, of course, taped his interview with Dr. Dietz. Mr. Dahmer is not insane in any sense. He is not psychotic. He is fully in contact with reality. He has, in my opinion, a superior intelligence, and I think the jury would immediately have seen, just a minute, there's nothing really wrong with this man in terms of hallucinations, in terms of delusions. I think people are willing to accept a type of insanity defense where there's a genuine separation from reality. This type of disorder that this man has, a sexual disorder, does not put him out of contact with reality in any sense of the word.
How do you think this whole grisly trial, Mr. McCann, has affected the Milwaukee community?
Well, Milwaukee is a wonderful city. I went to, as a student, I lived in Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Boston. They're wonderful cities, but I came back to Milwaukee because it's a very, very special place. I don't think it affects really the real quality of life in our city. Whether it affects the image, I can't tell. But I can assure you of this is a splendid community. It's caused some difficulty in our community, but it will be healed.
All right, Michael McCann, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Back in court in Milwaukee today, serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer for a sentencing hearing. Over the weekend, a jury ruled that Dahmer was sane when he murdered and dismembered 15 young men. He faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison for each killing. Today's hearing will determine if the sentences run concurrently.
Some real-life drama today in a Milwaukee courtroom. Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without parole in the killings of 15 young men and boys. The sentencing followed courtroom statements from relatives of the victims and from Dahmer himself.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you! This is out of control! Don't with me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you! Look at me! You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you. I hope you can deal with what you've done.
And for the first time, Dahmer spoke publicly about the murders.
This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a holocaust.
Dahmer said if it would bring back those he killed, he would give his own life right now.
Thanks very much. Coming up on 7/11 now, and on Close-Up this morning, Jeffrey Dahmer. Though few are mourning his death, the fact that he was murdered by another inmate while he was behind bars is a source of concern to the man who oversees Wisconsin's prison system. That man is Michael Sullivan, the Secretary of the Wisconsin Corrections Department. He's in Madison. Mr. Sullivan, good morning.
Good morning, Brian.
What can you tell us, sir, about Christopher Scarver, the man you're holding in connection with Dahmer's death? Has he yet been officially charged?
He has not yet been officially charged. He is an individual from Milwaukee County who was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, well armed, and was given a parole eligibility date of the year 2042.
Do you yet have a motive in the death of Dahmer?
No, we are waiting for the Columbia Sheriff's Department to finish their investigation, at which time we hope to have a better understanding of the motive behind the killing.
Since Mr. Scarver is an African American, and since a disproportionate amount of Mr. Dahmer's victims were also African American, are you assuming that race was a motivating factor?
I am not assuming race was a motivating factor. With the information that I have at this time. In fact, we believe it is not a factor in this instance.
Other than being of the same race, did Mr. Scarver have any connection at all with any of Mr. Dahmer's victims that you yet know of?
No, there is no connection with any of the victims that we are aware of.
You have one suspect in custody. Are you satisfied at this point that he was acting alone?
At this point, I am satisfied he is acting alone with the facts that are before me, but the Sheriff's Department and the Department of Justice will make the final determination on that.
So you're not discounting the possibility that he was part of some larger conspiracy?
I never discount anything, but again, I do not believe it was a conspiracy.
Given his crimes, Mr. Sullivan, and an earlier attack on his life, why wasn't Mr. Dahmer in special protective custody at the time he was killed?
It was our conclusion, which Mr. Dahmer agreed with, that the previous attack was an isolated incident by an individual who was trying to do something that he would be noticed for so that he could be exported out of the country back to his home country.
So you concluded that he was not at undue risk by being put in a housing unit with other dangerous criminals?
That is correct.
Help me out with the timetable on this, if you might. Was he supposed to have been under supervision at all times?
With the status he was in yesterday, he was not to be under direct supervision by staff at all times. He had been in a status in the housing unit he was in where he could leave the housing unit to go to a job situation and do that work, which would mean that he would not be continuously supervised.
Help me again on the timing here. He was supposedly escorted into the gymnasium area where he was killed at about 7:50. Reportedly, his body was found at about 8:10. During those 15 minutes, where were the staff personnel who were supposed to be watching over him?
At this time, I do not have exact information on whereabouts and activities of staff who were in the gymnasium at that particular time. That is being determined by the investigating Sheriff's Department.
Jesse Anderson also sustained injuries in the attack. Do you know of any relationship between Anderson and Dahmer?
No, I do not. I met with Mr. Anderson's family last night, and there was no connection that they're aware of, nor that I am aware of.
Bottom line, Mr. Sullivan, do you or other prison officials accept any responsibility for the killing of Mr. Dahmer? Should you have done a better job of protecting him, or should we view this as the natural consequence of a man like Dahmer being locked up with other dangerous people?
Well, I certainly do not consider this a national consequence. I consider this a real tragedy. It is something that we did not expect, and had we been aware of something pending, we certainly would have taken preventative action. We will be reviewing policies and procedures, and there are very likely to be modifications as to how we handle these situations in the future.
Michael Sullivan, you're a busy man. Thank you for joining us, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Prison officials in Wisconsin today continue their investigation into Monday's killing of mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was serving multiple life terms for killing and dismembering 17 people. He was beaten to death Monday in prison. There was strong reaction from relatives of some of his victims.
That I am happy and very excited that the monster is finally dead. I've never said he was never mental, he was never sick, he was nothing but plain evil.
Prison officials are holding another inmate, Christopher Scarver, in connection with Dahmer's murder.